Vincenzo Marchetti had not raised his voice in 14 years. Men who worked for him used to say that was the most frightening thing about him, that he never needed to. On the morning this story begins, he sat alone at the head of a long oak table in the back room of a butcher shop on Mulberry Street, a cup of espresso going cold in front of him, and he listened to a young man named Sal explain, in a shaking voice, why $300,000 had gone missing from a shipment that was never supposed to exist on paper in the first place. Vincenzo did not interrupt him. He never did. He let a man talk himself all the way to the truth, or all the way to the lie, because the difference between the two was always visible in the hands. Sal's hands were folded on the table, still. That was the first thing that told Vincenzo the boy was telling the truth. Liars fidgeted. Liars reached for water. Sal simply sat there, waiting for whatever was coming, because he already knew he might not walk out of that room. "Say it again," Vincenzo said quietly. "The part about the warehouse." Sal repeated it. Two of Vincenzo's own men had signed for a shipment that never arrived at its destination, and the paperwork trail ended at a name Vincenzo hadn't heard in almost 20 years. His brother-in-law, Frank Calabrese, a man he had personally vouched for at his own sister's wedding. Vincenzo had built his entire life around one principle, and it was not fear, and it was not violence, though both of those things followed him the way smoke follows fire. The principle was simpler than that. A man's word was the only currency that never lost its value. Everything else, money, property, favors, could be taken, burned, spent, forgotten. A man's word could only be broken, and once broken, it could never be repaired to its original shape, no matter how many apologies were poured into the cracks. He had learned this from his father, a tailor from Palermo who came through Ellis Island with nothing but a trunk of shears and thread, and who used to say that a man who breaks his word to save his life has already lost the only thing worth living for. Vincenzo's father never raised a hand to another human being in his entire life. Vincenzo had raised his more times than he could count, and yet he believed, without a single doubt, that he had inherited his father's exact philosophy, only translated into a language his father would never have recognized. He stood from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the wet cobblestone street, at a woman walking her son to school, at a fruit vendor arguing cheerfully with a customer over the price of lemons. This was the neighborhood he had grown up in, the neighborhood he still, in his own way, protected from other men exactly like himself, men with fewer scruples and shorter patience. "Bring me Frank," he said. "Don't tell him why. Tell him I want to talk about Christmas." It was July. 3 nights later, Frank Calabrese sat across from Vincenzo in that same back room, a glass of Vincenzo's own wine untouched in front of him, sweating despite the ceiling fan turning lazily overhead. Frank had married into this family 22 years ago. He had held Vincenzo's youngest daughter at her christening. He had wept, actual tears, at Vincenzo's mother's funeral. "You know why you're here," Vincenzo said. It wasn't a question. Frank's mouth opened, and for a moment Vincenzo watched him consider it, the lie forming, the excuse assembling itself behind his eyes, some story about a miscommunication, a clerical error, a shipment rerouted for safety. Vincenzo had heard every version of that story in 30 years. He could recite them the way a priest recites a liturgy. But Frank did something Vincenzo did not expect. He put both hands flat on the table, looked directly into Vincenzo's eyes, and told the truth. "I took it," Frank said. "All of it. My daughter, she's sick, Vincenzo. The kind of sick where the doctors say maybe if we try this treatment in Switzerland, and it costs more than I make in 10 years, and I couldn't come to you and ask, because you would have given it to me, and then it would be a debt, and I couldn't stand the thought of my daughter's life being something I owed you for the rest of mine." The room was silent except for the fan. Vincenzo had presided over confessions before. He had heard men beg, bargain, blame their wives, blame their children, blame the economy, blame God. He had never once heard a man confess to protect his own pride, rather than his own skin. Frank wasn't trying to save his life. Frank had already accepted that he might lose it. He was trying to die, if it came to that, without having asked for charity. This was the moment, later, that the men who worked for Vincenzo would talk about for years, in quiet voices, in kitchens and back rooms much like this one. Not because of what Vincenzo said, but because of what he did not do. He did not raise his voice. He did not call for anyone. He reached across the table, took the untouched glass of wine, and drank from it himself. "How much does the treatment cost?" he said. "The real number, not what you stole, what you actually need." Frank blinked. "Vincenzo." "The number, Frank." Frank told him. It was more than what he had taken. Vincenzo nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already calculated in his head. "You'll pay back every dollar you took, over time, on terms we'll discuss like men, not animals. And I will personally make up the difference for your daughter's treatment, and you will never, under any circumstance, thank me for it, because a debt between family isn't a debt at all, it's just love, moving in whichever direction it's needed." Frank's composure, which had held through the confession, which had held through the accusation, broke entirely at that sentence. He put his face in his hands and wept the way Vincenzo imagined he hadn't wept since he was a boy. "But understand something," Vincenzo continued, his voice never rising, never sharpening, simply continuing at the same even register it had held the entire conversation. "This is the only time. If you ever again choose silence over asking, if you ever again decide that your pride is worth more than the trust this family placed in you, there will be no wine on the table next time. There will be no conversation about Christmas. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes." "Say it back to me. Ask first. Always ask first, no matter what it costs my pride." Vincenzo nodded once, and that was the end of it. No blood was spilled that night. No message was sent to the street the way messages were usually sent, with warnings dressed up as accidents. And yet somehow, within a week, every man in that organization knew exactly what had happened in that back room, and exactly what it meant, and the effect on the men who worked for Vincenzo Marchetti was more powerful than any act of violence could ever have been. Because violence taught men to fear you. What happened with Frank taught men something rarer, and far more valuable to a man like Vincenzo. It taught them to trust that if they ever stood at the edge of their own worst mistake, there was a version of justice waiting for them that didn't require them to lose everything, provided they had the courage to tell the truth before they were caught in the lie. Vincenzo Marchetti died 11 years later, in his own bed, surrounded by 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 1 brother-in-law who had never missed a single payment and who had never once, in over a decade, needed to steal from anyone again. At the funeral, it was Frank who stood to speak, though he was not blood, though tradition might have called for someone else to take that place at the pulpit. He spoke for only a few minutes, and he did not talk about power, or fear, or the things men in Vincenzo's line of work were usually remembered for. He talked about a night in July, in a back room that smelled like aged wine and butcher's twine, when a man who could have destroyed him with a single word chose instead to teach him how to ask for help. He used to say that a man's word was the only thing worth more than his life, Frank told the room, his voice steady now, in a way it had never quite been steady that night so many years ago. But I think what he really believed, what he showed me, without ever saying it directly, was that mercy isn't the absence of justice. Mercy is justice, aimed at the future instead of the past. The room was quiet after that, the way rooms tend to go quiet when something true has finally been said out loud. And somewhere outside, on a wet cobblestone street very much like the one Vincenzo used to watch from that window, a woman walked her son to school, and a fruit vendor argued cheerfully over the price of lemons, exactly as they always had, in a neighborhood that a dangerous, complicated, unshakably principled man had spent his entire life